Hello and thank you for downloading. My name's Steve Johnson, and this is the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Hello and welcome to this episode of Inquests and Inquiries. This episode is looking at the UK COVID-19 inquiry, and in particular the Module 1 report and the government response to that. As in previous episodes, you'll hear two artificial intelligence voices which are based on a large language model that's analysed both the report for Module 1 and the government response to it. Before we get to those voices, though, a few thoughts from me just to prepare you. It's well worth looking at the documents yourself, and the links will be in the show notes. There are 10 recommendations in the COVID-19 inquiry Module 1 report, and the government has responded to all of them. And it's really worth showing some appreciation for that happening. It doesn't always happen with inquiries, and it's impressive to see it happening this fast. So that's a positive. However, overall, I found myself feeling slightly disappointed with the report. It's okay, but it feels a little bit like the inquiry is being fobbed off by the response. And I'm not even sure it's intentional. It just has a lot of classic government speak and government approaches to the recommendations rather than addressing the actual meaning and effect that the recommendation is trying to achieve. So I'll give you a good example of this. Recommendation 9 talks about the regular use of red teams. And the response is that the government agrees, and this is a classic PR technique in all of the recommendations. It's very rare for the government to say that it disagrees with the recommendation. So it agrees and then really goes on to explain how it's not going to do the recommendation. Red teams and recommendation 9 is not quite like that. It just says that it's been doing red teams and loads of red team stuff happens. Well, that kind of misses the point of the recommendation, which is if this was all going on anyway, then why was it not properly happening for this? So it's all very well to identify red team work that goes on now, but this is kind of like a passing grade C answer in in an exam or an undergraduate or postgraduate paper. The student has put loads of information down that's shown their knowledge, but they haven't really critically analysed the question, and that's just a bit of a shame for something which is coming from the Cabinet Office. Another good example here is Cabinet Office leadership for whole system civil emergencies in the UK. So recommendation from the module is very clear here that the concept of lead government departments should in its current form be removed and that the Cabinet Office should take the lead for the planning for all of this. And again, the point from the government is, well, the government agrees with the need for greater Cabinet Office role for whole system emergencies. And that is phenomenal PR speak. It's agreeing, but just not with the recommendation. And that's not really getting the point. In fact, it then goes on to say that the lead government department model is an essential role in preparedness and resilience. Well, what is the point of having an inquiry to do the analysis to try and understand these points if you're just not going to listen to why they felt that lead government department process didn't work? The opportunity to make those arguments was in the inquiry, not in the response to the recommendations. And if it was not possible to win that argument in the inquiry, just repeating the evidence that was submitted to the inquiry as your response is not a response to the recommendations. It is doing the same thing again. And that is just, a bit disappointing. Now, that's not to say that inquiry recommendations are always absolutely right and bang on, but it's not what a government response to a inquiry response recommendation is about. This doesn't feel anymore like a response to a recommendation. It feels like a discussion that should be happening within the inquiry. So that's a little bit frustrating as well. Amongst the rest of it as well, we have points about exercising, and there are some sort of positive points there. So a regular UK-wide pandemic exercise should happen every 3 years as the recommendation. The government response is, well, we're going to have one next year. And by next year, they mean this year, 2025. And that's great. It's great that they're having it, but that's not what the recommendation was. The point here is about regular and UK wide. And that was not really accepted by the government in their discussion there. It could be, and the door's left open a bit about tier one exercising, but it just doesn't feel like it's been properly addressed. But like many of the responses to the recommendations, the hardest thing about it is you can't really conclusively say that the government didn't answer the question. It's just a bit waffly, a little bit of a fudge. There's lots of good work going on, and sometimes work is cited which isn't really anything to do with what the recommendation was discussing as well. So, for example, there's a talk about data and research for future pandemics, and large tracks of the very long response to that recommendation talks about work and information which is nothing to do with future pandemics, and certainly nothing to do with data and research for future pandemics, which it's just a bit strange and it makes it quite difficult to read the overall document. I'm going to leave it there for the moment for the discussion of this. I'm going to do a separate podcast really picking apart the government response at a later time. But really interested in your thoughts both about what the AI think and also if you've had a chance to read those recommendations, what you think about it. So enjoy the podcast and please drop me a comment if you're interested.
All right, so we've got this massive report, right? The UK COVID-19 Inquiries Module 1 findings. And you want to know, did the UK really learn from its pandemic mistakes?
Oh.
Or was this all just a big fudge?
Yeah. I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head here. The stakes are massive, and this inquiry is really fascinating because of its scale and speed. I mean, no other nation has gone this fast to analyze its pandemic response. You know, the UK's COVID-19 inquiry, it's a huge undertaking, you know, a public inquiry. It's been tasked with examining in the UK's response and the impact of the pandemic. Module 1 specifically focuses on preparedness.
And we can't forget the human cost. The report reminds us about the impact, you know, the lives lost, the health and care systems pushed to their breaking point, the economic fallout. I mean, it's obvious why getting this right matters.
It really does. And the report doesn't hold back. It identifies some serious issues, you know, significant flaws, they call them, in the UK's pre-pandemic preparedness system. Basically, they're saying it was inadequate.
Oh, wow. So they're just straight up saying you messed up.
Yeah, pretty much. And they emphasize that preparedness is an investment. It's not a luxury. Think about it, like national defense, the cost of not being ready, it far outweighs preventative spending.
It's interesting, though, because the report says the UK was totally fixated on influenza.
Yeah.
They almost forgot about other pandemic threats.
Yeah, it's like only prepping for one type of cyber attack when there are vulnerabilities everywhere. The report calls this out as a major oversight. I mean, imagine being so focused on one threat, you miss the others hiding in plain sight.
Speaking of missed opportunities, the report really dug into past pandemic simulations, specifically Exercise Cygnus back in 2016.
Oh, yeah.
And it turns out Cygnus uncovered some pretty serious weaknesses.
Chilling, isn't it? Cygnus simulated a pandemic with a 50% infection rate and up to 400,000 excess deaths. Sound familiar? And this wasn't some fringe theory. The simulation came from inside the government.
Wow. Okay, so they had a warning.
Yeah.
Did they listen, though?
Well, not really. The report says that many of the recommendations from Cygnus, like bolstering social care systems, were largely ignored. And this raises a big question. Why weren't these warnings taken seriously? Was it a lack of political will, or were there other priorities that overshadowed pandemic preparedness? The report kind of suggests it was a combination of factors.
It's almost as if they thought, well, it was just a simulation.
Right, which turned out to be a huge mistake. And it brings us to another major finding groupthink and a lack of challenge within the government's expert advisory groups.
So you're saying everyone was just agreeing with each other, not wanting to rock the boat?
Basically, yeah. The report found that expert advice often lacked diverse perspectives and rigorous debate. This meant that crucial what-if questions were never really asked and alternative approaches were not considered.
Do you have an example of how this played out in the real world?
Absolutely. The report shows that lockdowns were never really on the table as a potential response, even when other countries were looking into them. This lack of open discussion meant valuable time and opportunities were lost.
So that's a pretty grim picture of the past. But what about now? The UK government has come out with new plans, a resilience framework, and a biosecurity strategy. Are they any good?
Well, there are some positive signs. Appointing a dedicated minister for biosecurity and setting up a council of scientific advisors are good steps. It shows that they're at least acknowledging the need for a more focused and strategic approach.
Okay.
And this is a big fine, but the report points out that these new plans lack concrete deadlines and measurable objectives. It's a bit like having a roadmap, but with no timeline or milestones.
So it's difficult to know if you're actually making progress.
Exactly. It remains to be seen if these plans will actually translate into real action, and crucially, if the government is truly willing to be held accountable. That's where things get even more interesting. The report doesn't just point fingers, it tries to dig into the why behind these failures. And a big theme that keeps coming up is accountability, or should I say lack of it. Who was responsible for these crucial decisions, and were they actually held accountable?
Right, because it's one thing to say you made a mistake, but it's another thing entirely to make sure that someone owns up to it and learns from it.
Exactly. And the report makes it very clear that accountability needs to run through every single level, from the highest office all the way down to the local implementation. It can't just be about blaming someone, it needs to be about making real systemic change.
So let's get into specifics. Where did accountability fall short?
Well, remember, exercise sickness and those ignored warnings about the social care capacity. The report actually states that the government failed to act with sufficient urgency or at all on those findings.
Wow, so they basically knew about the vulnerabilities but just didn't bother to do anything about it. Why?
Well, the report looks at a bunch of possible reasons. One of them is resource allocation. It seems that pandemic preparedness was often put on the back burner, in favor of other priorities, like Brexit planning.
Wait, are you saying that they prioritized Brexit over preparing for a potential pandemic that could have killed hundreds of thousands of people? That seems a bit short-sighted, to put it mildly.
Well, yeah, it's definitely a stark example of how political priorities can sometimes overshadow even the most urgent of threats. And the report makes it clear that this short-term thinking had some pretty bad consequences.
But, surely we can't blame it all on Brexit, can we?
You're right, there were other factors at play. The report also points to a certain level of complacency within the government. There seems to have been this belief that the UK was somehow special and less susceptible to pandemics compared to other countries.
That's a pretty dangerous assumption to make, especially when you're dealing with something as unpredictable and potentially devastating as a pandemic.
Yeah.
Nobody is immune to these global threats.
Absolutely. The report calls out this exceptionalist mindset, saying that it created a false sense of security and actually prevented effective preparation. It's a reminder that, humility and recognizing your weaknesses are super important in pandemic preparedness.
Okay, so we've got complacency, we've got misplaced priorities. Anything else?
Yeah. Another big issue that the report identifies is this lack of a clear and unified strategy. Responsibility for pandemic preparedness was scattered across different government departments, and this led to confusion and a lack of coordination.
It sounds like too many cooks in the kitchen with no one really in charge, making sure that all the necessary steps were being taken.
That's a good analogy. And the report strongly recommends a more streamlined and centralized approach with very clear lines of accountability and a single overarching strategy for pandemic preparedness. They're basically saying you need to get your act together and have a solid plan.
So less bureaucracy, more decisiveness.
Exactly. The report goes even further and suggests creating a dedicated and independent body to oversee every single aspect of pandemic preparedness and resilience. That would take the responsibility away from all those different departments and streamline the decision-making process.
That sounds like a pretty radical change. Do you think the government will actually go for it?
It's hard to say for certain. But the most important thing is that the inquiry has really laid bare all those systemic flaws that contributed to the UK's inadequate pandemic response. So now the government has a blueprint for change. They have a clear path to improvement. The question is, do they have the political will to actually implement it?
Let's hope they do, because as we've seen, the cost of inaction is huge. And it's not even just about future pandemics. It's about building a more resilient society as a whole, one that can face any challenge that comes its way.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another crucial point, the impact that the pandemic had on certain vulnerable groups. The report is really critical of the government's failure to adequately protect those most at risk.
So it wasn't just the virus itself that was causing harm. It's also about how society is structured and how inequalities actually left certain groups more vulnerable to the effects of the pandemic, right?
Exactly. The report highlights how the pandemic made existing inequalities even worse and how people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnic minorities, and those with disabilities were disproportionately affected.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's clear that a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't work in a crisis. Different people have different needs, and we need to think about those right from the start.
The report stresses that we can't just tack this on as an afterthought. It calls for a more nuanced and fair approach to pandemic planning, one that acknowledges the unique needs and vulnerabilities of different groups within our society.
So what are the suggestions for addressing this issue?
They recommend things like developing targeted outreach programs, making sure that vulnerable groups have access to essential services, and integrating those considerations of equity and social justice into every single part of pandemic planning. It's all about not leaving anyone behind.
Okay, so we've talked about accountability, we've talked about protecting those who are most vulnerable. What are some other key takeaways that we should highlight?
Another really important area is communication and transparency. The report found that the government's messaging during the pandemic was often confusing and inconsistent, and that led to a lack of trust from the public and people not really following public health measures.
Yeah, I remember all those mixed messages about masks and lockdowns and travel restrictions.
Yeah.
It was difficult to know what to believe or what to do.
That feeling of confusion and distrust was everywhere, and the report acknowledges that. It really emphasizes how important it is to have clear, consistent, and evidence-based communication if you want to build public trust and make sure that everyone understands what they need to do to stay safe during a crisis.
So less spin, more facts.
Exactly. The report recommends a few specific steps to improve communication, like setting up a dedicated communication team that focuses specifically on pandemic response, working with community leaders and those trusted voices to reach different audiences and being upfront about things that are uncertain and the potential risks involved.
So it's about being honest with people, right? Giving them the information they need to make informed decisions, even if that information isn't always positive.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The report suggests that this kind of open and honest communication is essential if we want to build trust and get people to cooperate. And those are absolutely crucial if you want to respond effectively to any kind of crisis.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Accountability, protecting vulnerable groups, clear communication and transparency. These seem like some pretty fundamental areas for improvement.
Oh, and we can't forget about the importance of learning from the mistakes that were made in the past. The report emphasizes that the UK cannot afford to repeat those errors that were made during the COVID-19 pandemic. They need to take these findings seriously and use them to make real and lasting changes.
Right, because pandemics, they're a part of life. It's not a question of if another one will happen, it's just when. And next time we need to be ready.
Exactly. And it's not just about being ready in terms of having enough hospital beds or personal protective equipment. It's also about having the right mindset, the right culture of preparedness.
What do you mean by the right mindset?
Well, the report talks about needing to shift away from what they call a culture of complacency and moving towards a culture of proactive resilience.
So we need to move away from reacting to crises and move towards proactively building resilience into every single part of our society.
Exactly. It's a big challenge, but the report argues like it's essential.
Yeah, it sounds like a huge shift, not just some small changes here and there.
Right.
It's about moving away from just reacting to crises and being more proactive about building resilience into every single part of our society. I mean, it's a big ask, but the report argues that it's essential.
Okay, so proactive resilience. How do we actually make that happen? I mean, it all sounds a bit abstract.
Well, the report breaks it down into a few key areas. It talks about the importance of having a really robust risk assessment and planning process. Meaning we need to always be thinking about potential threats and working out strategies to reduce their impact. It also highlights how important strong communication and coordination is between all the different government agencies, but also between the government and the public. So basically, no more silos.
Yeah.
Everyone needs to be on the same page.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just having all these plans written down on paper. It's about regularly testing and updating those plans, running simulations, and making sure everyone knows exactly what their role is if there is a crisis, like a muscle you need to keep exercising it.
Makes sense. But it can't all be about the big picture stuff, right? What about individual citizens? What can we do?
That's a good point. The report stresses that individual and community preparedness is just as crucial as government action. It encourages people to take steps like having emergency kits ready, knowing evacuation routes, and staying informed about potential threats.
So it's not just about waiting for the government to tell us what to do. We need to be proactive and take responsibility for our own safety.
Absolutely. And it's not about living in fear. It's about being prepared and having the right information. It's about having the knowledge and resources to take care of yourself and your loved ones if something happens.
Which leads us back to the main question. Has the government really taken all this on board? Are they really committed to doing what the report says, or is it all just empty words?
Well, it's actions that count, right? It's still early days,
Yeah.
but the government's response has been a bit of a mixed bag. So on the one hand, they've published the resilience framework and the biosecurity strategy, which shows that they are taking the issue seriously. And they've also appointed a dedicated minister for biosecurity, which is a good step.
But like we said before, those plans are a bit lacking in concrete details and measurable objectives.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell if they'll actually lead to any real change.
That's the problem. The report recognizes that these plans are just a starting point, but it emphasizes the need for clear timelines and ways to hold people accountable. We need regular progress reports, too. It's about making sure these plans turn into actual change on the ground, not just promises.
So we'll have to wait and see. We need to keep a close watch on the government and hold them accountable for following through on what they said they'll do.
Definitely. And it's not just up to the government. We as citizens have a part to play, too. We need to stay informed, engage in discussions, and demand action from our leaders. The inquiry has given us a roadmap. Now it's up to all of us to make sure it's followed.
Well said. This has been a really insightful and maybe a bit sobering deep dive into the UK's pandemic preparedness. Clearly, there were some major failings, but there's also a chance to learn from those mistakes and create a more resilient future. It's up to us all to make that happen.
Couldn't agree more. The lessons we learned from this pandemic are way too important to ignore.
And on that note, we want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought. The inquiry showed us where our systems are vulnerable, but it also showed us the power of working together. What are you going to do to make our society safer, more prepared, and more resilient? Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thank you for listening to the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Remember, you can find more information on the website, inquestsandinquiries.com, or on the YouTube channel as well. Link in the notes.